And so I wrote to the publisher of the magazine, and I said, dear sir, I don't have any claim. If you have any evidence to the contrary, I would welcome hearing from you. And I would expect a retraction if you don't have any evidence. And if I don't get a retraction, I'm going to sue you. Well, I had checked with our attorney beforehand, and he said, if you sue them, it's going to cost you hundreds of thousands of dollars. I said, what are you talking about? He said, well, you're going to have to fly to Austria. You're going to have to hire an Austrian attorney. You're going to be before an Austrian judge. And he said, what do you think your chances are of getting a fair trial, a fair hearing? Well, of course, I never heard from this guy because what he printed was a lie. But what we did, of course, was to continue writing stories. I sent reporters back to Austria. I did some stories myself. And finally, after 10 years, the Austrian parliament voted unanimously to turn all the art over to the Jewish community of Austria, and that's when they had an auction, and the proceeds of the auction went to heirs of victims, heirs of needy victims, or needy heirs of the Holocaust. And so at the auction, however, a very prominent rabbi from the Jewish Claims Conference announced at the auction that without ARTnews, this would not have happened. So it doesn't get any better than that to us, at any rate. And so there have been many other issues. I mean, we've had stories. Some of you may know, you're too young, most of you, but there was a big scandal in the 70s having to do with the Mark Rothko estate. Okay, the gallery that had represented the Rothko estate was found to be screwing around with the proceeds from the paintings that they were selling. It was the Marlborough Gallery, which was then the most powerful, the most important art gallery in the world. Similar to what, say, Gagosian or Pace Wildenstein is today. And so we published a story. In fact, it was in the second issue of my management just in October of 1972. And the title of the story was The Rothko Donny Book. It was simply a piece of journalism and reporting that this case is in the works. There's going to be a hearing, a judge, a trial, and so on and so forth. And so Marlborough didn't like the story. And so their lawyer called me and said, we're going to sue you for libel. I knew it was he was just trying to frighten me from doing subsequent stories about the trial, which was about to begin. He frightened me so much that I did a story myself the next few weeks, and I assigned other writers, including former colleagues of mine at the New York Times, to report on it. And then in his second breath, he said, I'm going to cancel my advertising. I said, I'm sorry to hear it. I would hope to welcome you back in the future to our growing list of advertisers, although the list wasn't growing in 1972 because the art market wasn't doing very well, like it isn't doing now well today. But that's another story. At any rate, they boycotted ARTnews for 8 years. And this is a bigger scandal than the scandal itself. They advertised in every art magazine. And you know why? Because no other art magazine ever carried any stories about the Rothko scandal. Other things, we've published stories about abuses in the printing of prints, okay, in which we named a couple of our advertisers. They no longer advertise with us. Well, they went out of business, not because of us, but these are the sort of things that we have tried to do. There are so many other things. The fact that among the artists that I've had an opportunity to meet, I mentioned Perlstein earlier, Rauschenberg was one of my favorites. And my wife and I were down in Florida not too long ago before he passed away. And he was reminiscing about how when he and Jasper Johns, his buddy, came to New York, total unknowns, and they didn't have the $10 a month rent that they had to pay, and they had to borrow it. And they managed to meet Leo Castelli, who was then a dealer and became a very famous dealer. And now, when we were down there, of course, his studio was on the island of Captiva, and just the studio and the property that he owned there was worth many millions of dollars. And Rauschenberg became an enormously wealthy man. And so he was there with his companion, Darryl, excuse me, and Darryl said, "Milton, would you like to hear a funny story?" I said, "Sure." He said, about 6 months ago, Bob was at his desk, at his secretary's desk. She was out to lunch, and he saw 2 pieces of mail addressed to himself. And he normally doesn't empty his mail because he's got secretaries to do it. And so he casually opened up, since she was away, he casually opened up one of the letters, and it was a check, at least he thought, for $1,600. And $1,600, you know, what the heck was that for Rauschenberg? So he casually put the check back in the envelope and put it in a drawer adjoining the secretary's desk. He didn't know it, but she didn't normally go to that desk. And so he said, Darryl said, a few weeks ago, Bob, again, he forgot that he didn't tell her anything about it, and the secretary accidentally opened up the drawer and opened up the envelope. It was a check for $1,600,000. And Rauschenberg rather sheepishly said, "Milton," he says, "I have trouble with zeros." Anyway, he was more important to me than being a great artist. He was a great human being. The decency, the integrity just shined. I mean, my wife and I, we went to, there were 3 memorial services in New York for him, one at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, one at the Guggenheim, and one at the Museum of Modern Art. And we went to the one at the Met, and Rauschenberg's sister stole the show from people like Chuck Close and Thomas Krenz and others, all the big shots. And she told the story of how when Rauschenberg was a youngster, he painted living at home with his mother and his sister, and he made a painting of a black woman nude. And as his sister was telling the story, the black woman, to use her exact words, was well endowed. And so the mother saw it, and she wasn't too happy about it, and so she put it away upstairs, stuck it in the back of a closet, and there it was for many, many years. And then years go by, and Rauschenberg is now a superstar. And one day he's visiting his mother with his sister, and the mother says, "Come on upstairs." And she takes the painting out of the closet. She had painted a bra and panties over the painting. Anyway. What else? On lots of folks' minds, of course, is the current state of the art market. And we know that the art market is suffering like the global economy, okay? That's the bad news is that the art bubble has burst, no question about it. That some of the insane prices, particularly from a number of contemporary artists, are no longer insane. They're back to reality, or a close approximation of reality. Several people have told me who know more about what's going on in the art world than I do, have said they think one of the positive things that will come out of this is the fact that artists will pay more attention to creativity rather than to the market. In other words, they won't keep turning out, but spending more, and out of it may evolve, and this usually happens, younger artists, and an appreciation, more of an appreciation for art rather than an appreciation for what the painting or the sculpture or whatever it may be worth. It's just extraordinary what's happening. Talking about Rauschenberg reminds me of de Kooning. De Kooning struggled for many, many years, as did so many artists, and some of them still do. Marisol, the artist, told me this some years ago. She was at his studio. This was before he emerged as a superstar. He was beginning to make some money. And she was at his studio one day, and he shows her a drawing, and he says, Marisol, he says, I just sold a drawing for $5,000. He couldn't believe it. I just sold a drawing for $5,000. He says, I feel like a thief. Okay, this was the thinking of artists in those days. But any case, what else can we tell you? Maybe we could open up to questions. Anybody has any questions that I can enlighten you or confuse you, I'd be happy to do it. Please.
I've done some writing for different publications in the arts, and what I've found is that just my modest attempt has gained some sort of attention to various artists. And I know you keep mentioning, especially with ARTnews, the influence you have on an artist's career. How much of a factor is that in your decision making in selecting artists to review their shows or have profiles for?
Okay, number one, there are several parts to your question. I don't think we have that much of an influence on artists' careers. Reviews certainly help. This is one of the things I'm going to talk about at greater length this evening, but reviews, to me, don't necessarily make careers. Again, as I was saying earlier, some people think because somebody's on the cover of ARTnews, this is an endorsement by ARTnews. It is not. It is for what I was saying earlier. Take the case, for example, of Julian Schnabel. If you read the reviews when he first emerged on the New York scene, he was getting clobbered, okay? And yet he managed to emerge as a big superstar. At least that's what he thinks he is. But at any rate, between us, I think he's a better movie maker. I know this is on video, but okay. At any rate, if you haven't seen his last film, go see it. It's one of the best films you'll see in years, about the butterfly, and I forget the exact title of it. A marvelous piece of movie making. Okay, as far as your question of reviews, in the case of New York, we rely on the editors based in New York to decide, for the most part, what to assign to galleries and museums in New York. Some of the reviews that we publish from New York are recommended by our roster of freelance critics who will say, gee, there's artist X who's at Gallery X. We just saw the show. It's fabulous. You ought to review it, okay? One of the frustrating things about my job and our job at the magazine is that on the one hand, we're not exactly living in a renaissance. But at the same time, there are a tremendous amount of artists all over the world who are doing great work. And unfortunately, we never have enough space to print all the reviews that we'd like to, okay? As far as the critics outside of New York, most of the time, since they are based, whether it's Los Angeles or Tokyo or Paris or London or Rome or whatever it is, they are closer to the scene than we are, and so we rely on their judgment. If they will email us or whatever, call and say, you should review this particular show, most of the time we'll say, go ahead and do it. I don't know if I answered your question. Okay. Anybody else? Yes?
The big issue that at least the LA Times has been concentrating a lot of attention on recently is the kind of implosion of MoCA and what happened there, and some of the issues that came up had to do with the fiduciary responsibility of the board as well as the director. Did you cover that? Was that a big story nationally? It loomed very large here, and I wondered how much attention.
Well, since we're a monthly magazine within the limitations of a monthly deadline, so we do have something in the works on that whole situation. The other issue, and it has to do with the closing of the Rose Art Museum at Brandeis, and there too, I think, in fact, I would be most interested if it's going to be addressed at the College Art Association. In case you don't know it, Ruth Weisberg is being honored at the annual meeting of the College Art Association, which is taking place here in town in a few weeks, for a distinguished lifetime award, and nobody deserves it better than Ruth Weisberg. So the issue of the closing, I think that's a complicated thing. For example, and we've discussed this at the last editorial meeting in New York. As you all know, the Rose Art Museum, the Brandeis University, has closed the museum, and they said they're going to sell this collection of thousands of works of art worth probably hundreds of millions of dollars. And they've been highly criticized for it. Okay, a lot of that is justified, but what complicates it to me is, what do you do with an institution that has many, many millions of dollars worth of art, and if they could sell one painting that'll bring them $20 million and help them resolve their financial situation, what's so bad about that? Because according to the rules of the Association of Art Museum Directors and the American Association of Museums, Museums Association and so on, you can't sell. I think somewhere in there needs a little bit more flexibility, particularly in times such as now, you know? It's very, very complicated. I don't pretend to have all the answers, but I think it should be addressed by the College Art Association, by the Art Museum Directors Association, and so on. Yes, Donna?
Annually, you do a magazine for 1 month a year that features the collectors. And you list the most important collectors, and you talk about what the collections are. When did you start that, and how do you choose who belongs in that group?
We blindfold everybody and we throw darts. No, that's what some people think. But again, as I was saying, we have this network of correspondents. We have the core editorial department in New York, plus the network of folks around the world, and we have contacts among dealers and collectors and auctioneers and scholars and so on and so forth. And we are constantly interviewing these people around the world. We don't pretend that this is the definitive list, of course, because there are collectors, not that many, but there are collectors who are so secretive that not even the chairman of the board of Christie's and Sotheby's, or the most sophisticated, the most knowledgeable dealers, know who they are. Because when they buy, it's either through three levels of different people and so on and so forth. And we keep it to people who are active. In other words, for example, Walter Annenberg, who was one of the great collectors, he was not on the list for a number of years because for a number of years he wasn't buying. Okay, we've had all sorts of experiences. Well, here, since I'm out on the West Coast, Mr. Frank Sinatra. Somebody from Christie's, a woman named Deborah Force, who's now a private dealer, and she was in charge of the American art department at Christie's, not contemporary, but early 20th century, going to and one of the most knowledgeable, most decent folks in the art world. And when she was at Christie's, she got a call one day from Barbara Sinatra, his wife, who said, "We have a couple of paintings by Edward Hopper, and we'd like you to come out. We want to appraise it, possibly sell them." And so Deborah went out there to the mansion in Palm Springs, and she pressed the bell, and instead of a bell, it began to play Strangers in the Night. And Barbara Sinatra, a very gracious woman, came to the door and brought her in, and they chatted for a while, and then she said, "Frank is upstairs sleeping," and she said, after a few minutes, "Please excuse me, but I have to call overseas," and she went into another room. I'll be back in a few minutes. And so Deborah's sitting in this big living room next to the pool. The doors were open leading to the pool, and she suddenly hears a voice, "How you doing, sexy?" And she looks around, there's nobody there. And also there's strangers in the night is wafting through the house. Again, she's looking around. Strange, how you doing, sexy? Nobody there. This happened 3 times. She looks around. Outside at the pool was a parrot.
Very good.
Also, they decided they didn't want to buy the painting. Didn't want to sell the painting, which was very smart of them. If they held on to it, they would have made many more millions of dollars than if they would have sold it at that time. And I'm sure that the Sinatras didn't need the money. What else?
I think we're heading into another class.
Okay.
Pressure, maybe one last question?
Sir? Yes, please.
Just quickly, I was wondering if you could comment on the status of contemporary criticism. At least a lot of people I know feel like criticism is more and more oriented towards promotion and advocacy and less towards, I don't know, engaging in critical debate. Do you think that's true? And if so, do you think, what can be done to combat that?
I completely agree with you. I think the state of criticism stinks, and this applies to all the arts, the visual arts as well as the performing arts. For years, I've been trying to persuade the folks in charge of the National Endowment for the Arts in Washington to give some grants to art historians and people who want to write, just how to write simple declarative sentences, okay? And because I'm allergic to the kind of writing that some critics are afflicted with. I mean, I read some things and I don't understand what they're saying. And I think that, and the problem is getting more complicated these days as more and more newspapers who are having serious trouble, as we all know, are eliminating their critics, okay? Cutting down on their criticism. One quick story, I mentioned Maya Shapiro. He was honored at a dinner in New York, a black tie dinner at the Pier Hotel a number of years ago, and he gave this fascinating talk, and at least most of it was fascinating. And then Ruth Gordon, remember Ruth Gordon, a pixie little actress, and she came up to the podium. You could barely see her above it. She was a tiny pixie, and looking at the professor, dear professor, I didn't understand a word you said, but it's great, just great that you know so much. Anyway, thank you very much.